long-running radio programs in Chicago, reported on the arts for several television outlets, and written for dozens of publications, and lectured internationally on India-related topics. After her MA in art history, she worked at the Smithsonian Institution before pursuing a career in journalism. Her first visit to India in 1985 led to many subsequent trips and ultimately an obsession with the country's vanishing stepwells. Victoria is the author of The Vanishing, Stepwells of India, and here's my copy. I'm waiting for COVID to end so that I can get it signed personally by Victoria. And it's a great book. I'm loving all the wonderful photographs in here. There's a photograph of the the one that you see on the screen. And it's not an academic kind of book, so it's very approachable, and it's very, very interesting. Loving it. And she has had great reviews as well. This one from the president of the Field Museum in Chicago. He says, astonishing hidden treasures, beautifully photographed and described in lively, interesting prose, an extraordinary book. The Vanishing Stepwells of India presents 75 subterranean wonders, although Victoria, fueled by her obsession, visited many, many more. And the book sheds light on a unique, if ignored, architectural structure. It also has GPS coordinates in the hope that readers will be inspired to see these elusive beauties with their own eyes. And now it's available in paperback as well. So I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to hand this over to Victoria.
Thank you so much, Sheila. This is a pleasure. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Let me just do a couple things here. I'm so happy to, I'm actually going to take my face off of there because it's disturbing me. This gave me an excuse to dress up and go into my closets and put on some finery. We all need to get ready for Diwali, and this is a good time to, I don't know, I think I needed to pick me up today. But I appreciate that lovely introduction. And yes, I just got my own first copy of the paperback version of the book. The original hardcover came out in 2017 and did well enough that the publisher decided to come out with the soft cover. But, you know, I love what you said, Sheila, about how it doesn't read like a dense scholarly book. And that was important to me, also because I am not a scholar, I am a journalist. I approach this as a journalist who just fell down the rabbit hole. And in fact, I'm not a photographer either. So I like to always show people, let me see if I'm holding this in the right place. This is the camera that I use on these trips starting 10 years ago, when I started actively taking pictures of the Stepwell. And you can see it is a junky $200 point and shoot camera that is always set on automatic. I don't know how to use it beyond that. If it ever gets off of automatic, I panic. I frequently had to hold it like that in my mouth, sliding down into some of these. But it goes to show you that I know a lot of really great photographers with incredible cameras and lenses, but you're really only as good as your topic. And I happen to find a fantastic topic. And I like to start this talk by sort of walking people through what my experience was, how this actually started. I went on my first trip to India, now it's almost 35 years ago. I was there for a month with a group of architects who were primarily interested in seeing contemporary modern architecture. They weren't quite as concerned with the historical architecture. We went to Ahmedabad in Gujarat. All of you are very familiar with these places, I know. Specifically to see the modernist architecture there of Louis Kahn and Le Corbusier. But one of our outings, our driver took us outside of town, about 15 minutes, 30 minutes. And at the time, we were told to get out of the car and go and look over this wall. There was no radio tower, there were no trees, there was no grass. It was very dusty, very hot, as Gujarat gets. And I didn't, I was young and stupid and ignorant and didn't really want to even get out of the air-conditioned car when I looked at this, what looked like a very pedestrian wall, and thought, why are we here? But then I looked over it, and that is what changed the course of my life, ultimately. We are conditioned to look up at architecture or across at architecture, but we are never conditioned to look down into architecture. And so when the ground fell away, as I looked over that wall into this complex structure, the likes of which I had never seen or studied. And yeah, I had a master's in art history. You look at a lot of architecture from all of history. I had never seen anything remotely like this. I couldn't even really tell what I was looking at, just that there was a parade of columns going down. I couldn't see the depth of the length of this thing. And then progressing into that structure, I was already kind of like gobsmacked by how disorienting it was to look down at something so complex and ancient. But walking into it was completely disorienting and really transgressive, because as I was walking into this, ultimately 6 stories, these are subterranean structures. So the ground level, I think you can see my cursor, is way, way, way up here. And you're walking down into these stairs, and my view kept shifting. The perspective kept changing. I couldn't see how far down I was going, but these towering carved columns and bridges that were going above my head as I went down, it was just absolutely mesmerizing. But beyond that, my senses were just so heightened by this experience in a way that architecture just doesn't normally do. It was very hot outside, as you can imagine, in India. And the further down I went, the cooler the air got. And that bright, harsh desert sunlight of Gujarat became darker and darker as I went down. And the air, which was so dry of that desert heat and sun, became almost clammy. But also, those of you who have been in India know that the din, that nonstop, screaming and honking and hysteria above ground became hushed the further down I went into this space. So that by the time I was at the bottom, it was as though I had entered a different world. It was transformative as I made my way down and then looked up through this well shaft to the top, to the ground from where I had been. And that transformation was exactly the way a stepwell would have been experienced, in this case, 500 years ago. Well, that was an incredibly powerful experience that I kept with me for, forever. It's still there, but I continued to go back to India many, many times after that, but always really as a tourist. I would go for a couple weeks here, a couple weeks there, travel around the country. But it wasn't until about 10 years ago that I went back to India and decided to embed myself as a journalist in the culture, not just going as a tourist, but I really wanted to absorb the country in a way that I wasn't able to do earlier. My son had gone away to college. I was by myself, and I just thought, I've got to do something that really is going to absorb me. And India was the most fascinating place. I just couldn't get it out of my system. So I decided to get it into my system. And one of the stories that I researched before I went was Stepwells. I remembered that powerful experience from 30 years earlier and wondered if I had embroidered it as we do our memories, or if it was really that powerful. I was a lot older then. By the time I went back. And so I decided to do some exploring. And that is what changed my life. I didn't know anything about that structure. I didn't know what it was. I mean, I heard in retrospect, it's a stepwell, but I did no research. And so I backed into the research on stepwells, which was a difficult thing to do. And one of the reasons I wrote my book, because there is very, very little that comes down through history of specific information about these structures. The first thing that I learned, which I did not know, we didn't actually have a guide for the stepwell. We just had a driver who said, go and look over the wall. So that was it. Is that, and this is a very basic picture of a very similar stepwell to what we just saw, is that they were water harvesting structures. They were born and evolved out of necessity in India, which has a very capricious climate, which is bone dry for 10 months out of the year, and then can rain during the monsoon for 2 months. And that water is a precious, precious commodity, still is, and definitely was then when there were no taps or, you know, any kind of plumbing. And so it was important to have access to a water supply 24/7 all the time. And it was a predictable climate. So stepwells were developed as a way to access water all year long, but also to preserve it for as long as possible. So the first step was to dig a long well shaft like this that would access at its lowest point, in this case 6 stories down, but I've seen these that are 13 stories deep, access the groundwater at its lowest level. Then during the monsoon season, when water percolates down into the water table, this water would fill up. And if you were a woman having to go down those steps maybe twice a day to the bottom, there could be well over 100, 200 steps during the dry season. But during the rainy season, as the water filled up, you didn't even have to go down that far. And sometimes these could be filled to the top. That was basically the structure of a stepwell. You can see, and this is a stepwell in Delhi, and I'm not even there during the rainy season, but you can see how that water fluctuates, so that this might be the low ebb, this is much higher. It can be extremely dramatic, as I'll show you. But what I discovered is that they were so much more than just water harvesting structures. That was their primary purpose. And without that ability to harvest and preserve water for their villages or community, that was their primary purpose, but they were multifunctional. And I think everything that I have seen, the most multifunctional structures of their day. One of the secondary features, particularly for Hindus, was as temples or shrines. And many of these, the names might have a deity, Mata, Mother, Bhavani, some kind of particularly mother goddesses, because those are the givers of life and related to water. So a number of these still exist. I'll go into those a little bit later. They could be shrines, where not an actual temple, but just pilgrimage sites. They were very important social centers too for women. This is not a stepwell, this is just a draw well, but women whose lives were so constrained and still are in India, they are the getters of water. They are the people that must go every day, several times a day, to fill up water containers. And you've been reading about the water crisis. They sometimes have to walk miles and miles and miles. But getting out of your house and in that constrained lifestyle that they had then and still do, and being able to meet at the stepwell with other women would have been a very important thing. And in fact, they were important charitable gifts to the community, these stepwells. I bring that up in connection to women because it's believed that some 25% of these were commissioned by women, royal women, wealthy women, as gifts to their community. They were expensive to build, and building one was a way of showing that you were a benevolent ruler if you were indeed in charge of that community, but just that you wanted to give back, and your name might even be remembered. Not always, but sometimes we have plaques that actually mention the name of the people that created these. They were very important along the trade routes, which, you know, when you remember Stuckey's, you used to stop at Stuckey's and get your pecan log, kind of like that. You needed to have a stepwell or someplace to get water within a day's ride for pilgrims, for the trade route. This is one in Gujarat that I only found because of this incredible herder that I ran into searching for not even this stepwell, but he showed me and my driver, not my driver, we had a driver, but my good friend Nirav Panchal, who is an award-winning guide in Gujarat, and I turned him on to Stepwells. We had a couple of great Stepwell escapades, and this fellow just scampered off into the underbrush, and we went racing after him to find not just this Stepwell, but another Stepwell. They were important cooling centers, as long, besides just being civic centers, when in India, and Gujarat in particular, can become 120 degrees in the summertime, being able to get into the shade of a stepwell, or later, after Muslims proliferated throughout India, they brought with them a type of stepwell that had these kind of arcades and loggias and apartments where you could actually, go in there and rest for days if you were part of a traveling group or a trader. But when you get to the bottom of a stepwell, you can feel the difference of sometimes 10 degrees, which makes a big difference when it's that hot outside. There, and I'll show you in a minute, there's just an extraordinary range of styles of stepwells. No two stepwells are alike. It's one of the things that was so exciting to me about sort of stumbling into this topic, is that, every time you see one, it's a different thing. And yes, there can be elements that are like, some look a lot alike. There's one that is a kind of mirror image of another, but they're all like fingerprints or snowflakes. And along with that, you get real differences in the materials and the way they're built. And I just put these two slides in. I wish I'd used them in earlier lectures to show you that a lot of times you can tell a lot about the geology of the area based on the way the stepwell is built. The one on the left in Delhi, which has a very rocky kind of geology. And in fact, this is in the Mehrauli archaeological park, where not nearly enough people go. And you can see in this picture that they actually hit rocks and incorporated them. I just love that, into the building of the stepwell. So in Delhi, most of the buildings that you see are actually rubble filled. They're like faced with stone and rubble behind them. And the ground is so rocky that you don't require any buttressing. But in Gujarat, and other parts of Rajasthan, where the ground is much softer, it's like a loamy clay, you need incredible amounts of buttressing and cross bridging in order to hold the walls at bay. And this is just a crazy stepwell in Vadodara, Baroda, Gujarat, that just like, you can't even really tell what you're looking at. There's so much cross bracing. But the stylistic range is really extraordinary. And I don't have all of these labeled because there's no point. I'll be looking at some of these more closely, but they can be very intimately scaled and small. This is not even the smallest one. I've seen tiny, tiny little stepwells, and then gargantuan ones like E.Y.H.O on the right. Very basic utilitarian stepwells that you see in villages, like the one on the left, that have really no decoration at all, or others that you can tell that a lot more money and time and craftsmanship was spent on them. This one on the right, outside of Ahmedabad, that has those niches going all the way up to like 7 stories to the ground level. Most of them are, the most common shape of these is just a straight line, just a trench that was built adjoining that, that well shaft. Simplest thing to do, just sink the shaft, create a trench next to it with some steps, and that's it, boom, you're done. But L-shaped, you get a lot of L-shaped stepwells. Nobody has successfully explained why that exists, what it has to do with, but it's interesting when you go in and then you go make a big hard right or a hard left. A lot of circular ones. This one on the right, which is so simple, that's outside Champaner in Gujarat. It's one of the most beautiful sinuous shapes and just so magical. Some really eccentric ones. This square thing, a lot of people it's hard to get through one of these talks without somebody saying, oh, it looks like an Escher. This is not the one that really looks like an Escher, but it's like an Escher, that kind of square thing. And in order to even get that picture, I had to knock on the door of this craftsman's place. I mean, I don't even remember. I think he repaired pots, and I had to climb up onto his roof and lean out and get that picture. That is not unusual to get pictures of these. So square you do get, but then octagonal, it's a shape you get as well, this one outside of Delhi. And then there's another type of stepwell, which is really defined by its design. It's a KUND. And you recognize these instantly. They tend to be very steep, although not always. They're defined by this kind of rectilinear funnel shape and by the pattern of their stairs. This is a way, this kind of triangular stair is a way of accessing the ground and the furthest down that you must go, the groundwater, as quickly as you possibly can. Because that gets you down much faster. It's like a cliff face than if you start with a series of stairs that are just linear. You'd have to start way far back. But can you imagine going down that thing in a sari? Or, I mean, I went down every single one of these, and I can tell you, it's terrifying. It's terrifying. And I always wonder what's at the bottom. But you cannot take a bad picture of a stepwell. I mean, that pyramidal sculptural set of stairs, it's just a magical thing to see. There's nothing like it. And they're quite beautiful. Well, and this one I like to put in because it's such a bizarre structure. This is in Varanasi. And very hard to find. Most people don't see this. And this particular stepwell, LOLARK KUND, illustrates a lot of the problems that I had in doing the research for this book, or just in general, trying to get information about it. LOLARK KUND, which is it's surrounded by little temples above the Ghats. And, you see in my book and in this lecture that I might have a question mark as far as a date. Sometimes in my book, I list 3 or 4 dates because the dates are always disputed. Like there can be 4 centuries or more. If I've done research and found references by real scholars or articles or websites that might say this is 4th century, oh, it's 10th, it's 12th, it's 16th. I put that in. It just shows you how difficult it is to actually nail something down. So LOLARK KUND was one that there was never a date. I can't even find any information about it. But Varanasi is one of the oldest continually lived in cities on Earth. And all the references that I saw to LOLARK were that it was very old. So, what does that mean? I had 3.5 months to write this book. It was hard to consult with people all the time. I just grabbed 1,000 AD out of the air. That's not true. A lot of this is not going to hold up if anybody could ever date it. But it is obviously the pool here, and it's such an extraordinary looking thing. It's an extremely old structure down there. This is obviously much newer. But what I wanted to point out is this picture on the right of LOLARK KUND, which for pretty much 364 days a year looks like this picture, where it's pretty empty. It's incredibly steep, really just mind-bogglingly steep, like going down in Tikal or something. You have to go almost on your behind. And yet there's piles of wet clothes you see at the bottom here. That's not because people are doing their washing. Once a year, during the monsoon festival, in September, in fact, is a festival that takes place there. This is a KUND that is dedicated to Surya, sun god. And the idea is that once a year, women who dip in that holy pool, and you can see how small it is, if they dip in the pool and leave behind some kind of a offering, it's often fruits and vegetables, which they vow never to eat again, and jewelry, which is why there is a priest in there, quickly picking up the gold as fast as he can. You dip in it, you leave your clothes behind, and you will then be blessed with a child, and really that means a boy child. But it is basically a fertility festival, and thousands of couples come. It's a whole big deal. The pictures of it and the sounds of it, I've never been. That would terrify me, particularly now. Like, can you imagine? But I love seeing this before and after picture. And I just wish I could see the picture of the mounds of clothing which are left behind, which must look like Woodstock or something. So Stepwells were found all over India, thousands of them. The number that is batted around is like 3,000. That is something that was just made up by somebody. There is no way of knowing how many. I think there's probably 3,000 of them still now if you go into every village and see them. But I did not do my research in a particularly scholarly way. I mean, I have been all over India, and there are places where stepwells aren't. For instance, the south, where there's much more water there. So there wasn't any need to create a water system as elaborate as these stepwells were. You get temple tanks there. If you've been to Hampi, there's the Queen's Bath. Those are not the same kind of water hauling pieces of architecture that had all the same kind of routines built into them. But you can see all of these circles. That's where I have seen and been to stepwells. There's places I haven't even put on this, but it's just to give you an idea. Gujarat is down here, Delhi's up there, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot in Haryana. You expect to find more stepwells in those dry western states of India. So the history of stepwells is really interesting. The very first ones, and again, we have no specific one that is known to be the earliest, and were rock cut. They're believed to have been between the 3rd and the 5th or 6th century AD, cut out of living rock, carved out like the 2 stepwells here, which are not that early, and the dates are in dispute of these two. But it gives you an idea of what it's like to just hack out a trench from living rock, in this case limestone, which is relatively soft, but still those were the first types of stepwells, very simple with just some steps going down. And then the first ones that you do get that we know of are in and around the town of DHANK, Gujarat, which I am pretty willing to bet none of you have ever been to, let alone heard of. I was thankfully with Nirav Panchal when we went on trying to find this, and it was hard for him, and he's Gujarati and speaks everything and is brilliant, but we had a hard time finding this village. And then once we were in the village, we had a really hard time finding this stepwell, which is right in the middle of town. And the town is like 10 square blocks, and nobody knew where it was, because stepwells, and I'll tell you more about this later, are kind of like background noise. They do not have a presence in India very much today, particularly in a small town. But this group of stepwells, of which I saw 3, are the first structural stepwells that were not just carved out of rock, but were actually intentionally built with stone, with masonry. And you can see how narrow it is, how really sort of crude it is. But even within that, these early ones had niches where deity sculpture would be, like this one here. Within a couple hundred years, the engineering was such that these did become marvels of architecture, art, design, and engineering. I talked to a bunch of engineers and hydrologists when I was doing research for the book, and it turns out that building down into the earth is much, much harder than building up, using gravity as the force versus having to keep the earth at bay, and which is why those structural components and buttresses and bridging was so important in places where by the time you got to the bottom and the ground was really forcing it in, if you were digging through a sandy soil, goodness knows how many of these collapsed. But now this, Chan BAORI, now I understand there's at least one person on this, this Zoom talk who has seen this, and anybody who has seen this is really, really lucky, because I can tell you, I must have gone to India 10 times before I got to see this. And this is a stepwell, one of the oldest, deepest, and largest in India. and to my mind, one of the most interesting in terms of the type of architecture that it is. This is 15 minutes off the highway between Jaipur and Agra. How many millions of tourists are going by this, every tourist season in India, or were on their way to Fatehpur Sikri. And yet, when I've given this talk, and I can't see any of you, unfortunately, but if I said, how many of you have been on that road? Everybody raises their hand. How many of you have seen this? And there may be like one or two, and everybody else wants to just cry or shoot me or something. It's getting more known now because the government took it over recently, and they're charging for, charging for admission, and it's getting a lot more attention. It has been in several movies. I think most recently it formed part of the prison in Batman: The Dark Knight Rises, or something like that. Anyways, The Dark Knight. It was also memorably, only for 30 seconds, in a film called The Fall by Tarsem Singh, but one of the most brilliant uses of his Stepwell. Anyway, Chand BAORI, and you can see this is a KUND. You now recognize that steep funnel shape, pyramidal stairs, of which I'm told there are 3,500. I've never counted them, but that's what they're saying. You're free to count it. When I first saw this, there were no fences down here to break your fall. There's fences up here too. I have read that somebody did fall and hurt themselves. And you do wonder how many bones are at the bottom of that, if you dredge it like the cenotes in the Yucatan. But this was built around 800 by King Chand, which means moon. And he was a Hindu Maharaja at the time. And we know that because there are still deities down in these niches, down by the water level, who are blessing this water, and would have been underwater as the water level grew. This type of architecture, this very straight, flat roof line, these stubby little columns, this is very typical of early Hindu architecture. The true arch and the true dome did not come to India until centuries later with Islam, which is why when you look at this, it's kind of like a transporter malfunction. Around sometime in the 18th century, this was updated thanks to the local Muslim ruler who slammed his own kind of pleasure palace, this series of rooms cascading down, just built over the original structure. So this kind of, these elaborate types of arches and these beautiful fluted columns, those are all very clearly Islamic architecture. So this was a piece of architecture that was linked across 1,000 years by two faiths and two styles. And that is really rare. And it's just the most fabulous thing. We all have to go back and see that when we all go together. One of the things that, what happened after Stepwells, after 800, is that Stepwells do proliferate everywhere. Everywhere they need water, you find Stepwells. I mean, yes, there are draw wells, there's other types of water, but Stepwells can accommodate a lot more people in the community. Lots of different things can happen in them at the same time. People can be hauling water at the same time they're going down and washing their clothes or doing prayers. And you find them in villages and cities and on those trade routes. And you also find them in forts, like this one, for instance. This is the Red Fort, and most people who've been there, again, one of, it's an incredible tourist site, but Stepwells hide in plain sight because they have so little above ground presence. Like, you can literally be across the street from one of these and have no idea it's there. And I've spent hours driving up and down, trying to find a Stepwell. But if it looks like this, you could literally be walking on that grass, and if a plane goes overhead and you look at it, or a bird, you could just fall right into it. They are subterranean, and some of them have ways of marking their presence, but a lot of them don't. And they are often within feet of tourist destinations like the Red Fort. And there's many, like around Delhi, that people miss, and all over the place, really. This one is particularly interesting because we don't know exactly when it was built, 1400, it's in dispute. There's lots of different theories about it, but this is, it was actually beautifully made. It is rubble filled, but you can see it's got beautiful kind of masonry stone walls. And it's not exactly an L shape, but it's a mirror image of itself. And one of the reasons why I like to show this, other than the fact that most people never get to see it, is that it was used by the British Raj in the 19th century. They turned it into a jail. If you look closely over here, and I really need to go and get a better slide of this, they actually filled in some of the windows there, and you can kind of maybe basically make out, they've still left up the bars from the jail cells, where in pre-partition India in the 1940s, they actually jailed freedom fighters there in those rooms. At one point, this was going to be made into some kind of a museum for freedom fighters. That didn't happen. It was taken over by the Indian Army after the British left, turned into a latrine, which so many of them were, big hole in the ground. And then the Archaeological Survey of India took it over, and now you just can't see it for the most part. Another example of something hiding in plain sight, and also in the way stepwells are now embedded in cities that grew up around them. This is on a little residential street right by Connaught Place in the center of Delhi, the most like noisy, crazy area of town. This stepa, which is, well, you walk down the street, you see a little wall on the left, that kind of rubble wall, which is so typical, and you go in and then whammo. This is not even that elaborate a stepwell, but at the time this was built, it was well outside what was the capital of Delhi then. It would have been used by travelers, and you can see this series of like rooms down at the bottom, and you can enter into those. It was quite cool. You could get your water if it was there down here. It was funny, when I first went and saw this like 9 years ago, there was nobody there. It was really, really, like most of these abandoned, nobody cared. People were looking at me like I was insane going into it. And then a movie with Amir Khan, if you know your Indian movie stars, he's one of the greats. Amir Khan started a movie called PK, which features, it's kind of a stupid movie, but it features an alien. He plays an alien who crash lands on Earth, and he uses this stepwell as his home. And so ever since then, when you go in there, there's like young couples canoodling and making out, and it's kind of, I mean, it's being used, which I think is great. And there's not a lot of places for those kids to go. Now I have to show this one in terms of hiding in plain sight, and also the fact that we know so little about them, and one that is missed and should be seen. This is just off the highway between Delhi and Jaipur. It's about 2.5 hours. The town of Nimrana. There's a fabulous, the first fort hotel in India is the Nimrana Fort, where you can stop and have a kind of mediocre lunch looking over the plain of Rajasthan. And I went looking for this, and you know, there's a wall, you know, you've got to look over a wall now whenever you're in India. I do that. It's like Pavlov's dogs. I'm always like, what's over that wall? And I never find a stepwell that I wasn't looking for. But this one, you come around that wall, and it's like, it's just, you know, the biggest thing you've ever seen, and so deep and so scary. But this too, I just put 1570 in there. In my book, I think I have 4 different dates. We just don't know anything about it. In this area, you can see it's so big that, and the sand there is very, you know, it's desert soil. So you can see these massive bridging units. This is the place where I actually became obsessed with stepwells. Before, I was just intrigued with them and wanted to, before I went back to Gujarat, I was studying these in Delhi, went down into this stepwell, and standing there looking at this extraordinary, mysterious, decrepit, unknown structure, it was like somebody just went bam in my face. And I was like, I changed my trip, I changed my life. And I thought, I now have to see every one of these. But now we're going to head all the way down here to Gujarat, where the earliest stepwells are, and the ones that are still in the best condition, and Hindu ones remain. A lot of the Hindu ones that were in the north don't exist anymore. They were destroyed. But, and I know that some of you have seen this, but, you know, again, Rani Ki Vav, which became a World Heritage Site in 2014 after trying for like decades to get that, you know, that honor. This is a great example of a stepwell that we know something about for a change. There's that wall, you approach it. The Grand Canyon, I was just at the Grand Canyon, it reminded me of this because you're kind of walking along and you have no idea what you're about to see. And then this just immense, crazy thing is ahead of you. This is the largest, the most grandiose, most expensive stepwell ever conceived in India and anywhere, because they are unique to India, to the subcontinent. You get them also in Pakistan. But there was a panel that talked a lot about the queen, Udayamati, queen who commissioned this extraordinary thing. Like most queens, when they did that, it was to honor their deceased husband. So her husband, Bindev, who had died, she was honoring him by building this. There's a book written about it that's out of print by a great scholar, Kirat Mankodi, who thinks that it took probably about 20 years to create this structure. And this gives you a better idea of just how insanely big it is, that uses a combination of those straight steps and also those KUND steps, because otherwise this thing would be, you'd have to like start at a half a mile away. Enormous buttressing on the side to hold in that earth. But what happened was tragic. It was the most extraordinary structure of its day. I mean, I defy people to find something from the mid-11th century in Europe that is anywhere near as complex as this structure was, and besides, you know, underground. But what happened is the source of water, the groundwater for this, was an underground river that changed course, we think within 100, 200 years, probably 100 years after it was completed. And it changed course and busted through the well here. All the water came pouring in and eventually kept flooding it, which silted up and parts of it collapsed, and it basically languished under silt for 800 years. When the British found it in the 19th century, it looked very much like this early photograph. And you can see these stumpy columns here, and really nobody really knew what it was until the Archaeological Survey of India decided to start excavating it, first in the 40s and 50s, and then seriously in the 80s. And it was like discovering Pompeii. It was, you know, everything was so well preserved under that silt. And there were 600 sculptures, the most elaborate, detailed sculptures, and these columns, no two alike. I mean, look at that thing. And I also have to point out that Patan, where this is in Gujarat, which is about an hour or so outside of Ahmedabad, also known for its patola weavers, there is no stone in Patan. All of this stone had to be hand hauled there in the mid-11th century from a mine, a quarry 140 kilometers away. Look at that detail. And these are all scenes of the Ramayana. But you're just seeing a little fraction of Rani Ki Vav because, you know, a lot of it was taken away and collapsed. And it ended up 5 kilometers away. So when people are looking at Rani, they tell me they're going there, I say, figure out how to get to Bahadur Singh, theoretically a protected site, which means that sometimes there's a person there sleeping on this charpoy, but not always. And this is a great story because in the 19th century, 1805, this man Bahadur Singh owned the property where Rani Ki Vav was and decided he wanted to build a stepwell of his own for irrigation, which is what they were often used for, of his surrounding land. And, you know, as most cultures do, if there's something that you can cannibalize that saves you some time and trouble, then cannibalize it. I want you to just remember those domes in the background. So Bahadur Singh just carted off a lot of what he could grab from, you know, at that point it hadn't been excavated, and stuck it into this 19th century shell. So you get a mini version of Rani Ki Bao inside this ersatz frame. And it's fascinating because they didn't all fit. These were designed for a different structure. And so Bahadur just like cut some down, added some plinth underneath them. But it's interesting because when you go there, you get much more of that intense feeling of going into a stepwell by going into this ersatz Rani Ki Bao than you do going into Rani itself, which is so big and open now to the sky. You can have this much more, you know, quiet experience at Bahadur Singh. I asked you to pay attention to that little dome, and that's because, you know, by 1411, that's a very specific date, that is when Ahmad Shah founded Ahmedabad. And when the Muslims really took over India at that point, a couple important things happened. First of all, they had their own tradition of water architecture, which is incredible. You know, if you've ever been to, well, I mean, the Taj Mahal is a great example, but like, in Spain, I have COVID head, I can't remember the name. Anyway, water courses and fountains, they really knew their way around water, but they had never seen a stepwell because nobody had needed to build a stepwell before. And when they came to India and they were taking down Hindu monuments and, you know, temples and graves and what have you, there was an edict that you could not destroy a stepwell, which is why so many of them still exist in Gujarat, but also they began to build them themselves with some incredible flourishes. And the Islamic flourishes that came to India were important, like the true dome and the true arch, like, and you see those here, the use of these 9 pillars, the number 9 is important, and octagons. This is something that never existed in Hindu architecture. And even you can't see this, this is just outside of Ahmedabad. There are benches lining the outside of these, so you were encouraged to sit and stay there. Also, there are circular stairways that often go down the middle of these. These were all things that, that Islam brought to the design of Hindu architecture, and in this case, specifically stepwells. And for a couple of years in and around Ahmedabad, there was a merging of the two styles that was brilliant in a number of stepwells, including this one, Dada Harir, where you can see clearly that the craftsmen, this cast of craftspeople who were the sculptors and the architects and the builders of Hindu wells for centuries, for millennia, were now turning their hand to Islamic wells. And you would never know the difference unless you were really aware of it. For instance, these, right now, they were still allowed to use flora and fauna, but pretty soon that fell out because you're not allowed to have any kind of imagery like that in as decoration in any kind of Islamic structure. But these would have had deities inside. These are inside the wellhead itself, like this one, which is from Rani Ki Bao, sleeping Vishnu, as a way of bringing the deity into the well. We are not going to do that in an Islamic built well, but they had to appeal to the Hindu population. So you get flourishes like this, oh, what is that flower? I forget, I have it written. Oh, it's a lotus, sorry, it's a lotus. You get imagery that would have been recognizable to Hindus and still could have been worshiped as a shrine, but wasn't overtly Hindu. Or in this case, these beautiful sinuous deities that you see the background here, a tree of life, which was a symbol both in Islam to Muslims and to Hindus. But Muslims brought another thing, another type of stepwell entirely. All the stepwell we've seen so far have been very external. They've been community wells. They were for that community and they were accessible to that community. But rich and powerful Muslims began to build something called a retreat well, a very, very private, inward-looking well that you wouldn't even know was there. This one, for instance, in Mehmedabad, a couple hours outside of Ahmedabad. I mean, you would just trip over that and think it was a dance platform, or I don't even know. It's the craziest looking thing on the outside. But that was built in a private garden for a general. And these were really places of retreat for the family and friends of whoever it was that built it. So it's built in a circle around the shaft of the well itself. This is the water hauling equipment up here. And you would go there during those hot, hot months of the summer as a cool retreat and spend the day. And the women in Purda were in these little awful rooms. They weren't even with where the light was. And these are, niches for candles, for oil lamps. And I can tell you here that it's very challenging going into a lot of these stepwells. They're really in terrible shape, many of them. I'm not showing the really hideous ones because why would you want to see that? But anybody who has problems with not just acrophobia, because I'm climbing out onto legends, but filth of every possible kind you can imagine, human and animal, bugs, bees, lizards, snakes, and a mongoose that nearly killed me because it scared the hell out of me. If you have any of those problems, these are not places for you to go. And bats in particular, which I don't really mind, except this room, I could not go in there because I knew if I took my camera in there, I could hear the screeching of thousands of bats in that room. And I thought if I go in there and take a picture, even without the flash on, they would all come out in my face and I would hate it. But this kind of retreat well reached its peak in a well that this is from the fort in Agra, Akbar's BAORI at the Red Fort in Agra. And the head of the fort didn't really know about it, had never been there. I had read about it in a scholarly book. And again, this just looks like a subway grate in New York or something. You cannot get a picture of this kind of spiral well. It goes down 7 floors. That same style, like a central shaft with rooms arranged around it. This is what that looked like. And I can tell you that this is one of the most elaborate subterranean structures that you could imagine. These are double-story rooms that were painted. I mean, the pictures are abysmal that I took, but there is a stairway that literally winds around this thing, plus another stairway that just goes straight out this way that they thought was maybe for Akbar himself. It's an extraordinary structure that nobody's ever seen. Okay, so in the last couple minutes here, what happened? How did this unique, unbelievable, important typology, this whole form of architecture, fall off the grid of history? We go to forts and temples and mosques and everything in India, and these are not in guidebooks, at least they weren't then. It's changing a little bit now. They're impossible to find. Anyway, what happened? Why do they look the way they do today? So many things happened. I used to blame this on the British. That's not really true. I mean, it's true that when the British came, they were there from the 16th century, but during the Raj, I mean, the idea of an open well where animals are drinking and there's lots of people going to it and it's open to bugs and pests and whatever, that was not going to fly with the British, and they probably destroyed a large number of them. We have no way of knowing. But also, they brought progress to India in the form of hand pumps and village tanks and later plumbing. That was going to come to India anyway. And if you were a village woman or a woman anywhere who had a choice between pumping the water into your lota from the village well or walking down 200 stairs, I mean, duh. But at the same time, once that kind of progress was made in India, these stepwells began to become untethered from their original purpose, which was to provide water 24/7. And even the ones that were used as temples, they may have retained their sanctity in some way, like this one in Gujarat, and there's a number of these, that no longer function as actual temples, but they may still have an important shrine where people go. There was no longer a reason to go and keep it clean. People weren't drinking out of them anymore. You didn't have to keep the water pure. You might maybe could use it for irrigation or what have you, or washing, but they became untethered and they lost their importance in the community. This is that same Stepwell. I mean, yeah, people may go and worship at that one shrine, but this incredible 13th century Stepwell said, yeah, God, I can forget some of this stuff, is still filled with trash, because that's not what's important about it. What's important is that one area. Also, what happened is a Stepwell like this, which would have been in the hinterlands, end up being encroached by the cities that grow up literally on top of them. This one, I had to knock on people's doors and climb out onto their houses. I had to do that a lot. Can you imagine doing that here? Meanwhile, I mean, you could get shot. But there, everybody's like, yes, come in, have tea, have dinner. Just adorable. Some of these, I mean, this is another one that's embedded in the city. In fact, I had to send Nirav to go and get the GPS coordinates. I couldn't find it. It was so locked into this town of Kapatvanj, which has a number of fantastic stepwells from the 12th century. But, you know, people ask about government protection, and this one is considered protected in that there's a sign out front saying, if you do something bad to the stepwell, we'll fine you 500 rupees. And I think of like the earliest structures that we have in this country, which are much later than this, you know, maybe from the 16th century or something. But God forbid you touch a wall or drop something, you know, the SWAT team is going to come and get you. But here is this unbelievable structure that is literally just falling apart. It's been mined for stone. There were originally 3 entrances. People just built right on top of it. This would have been a very, very deep and meaningful stepwell. Or this one that, I mean, again, I could only find this by, it was impossible to locate. I found a hole in the door over here and I looked into it, that's right here, and realized this was a 16th century well that there was a reference to, and it's being used as a garbage dump. People are just throwing stuff out their windows. I'm on top of a library roof taking this picture. But I have to say that I have changed my opinion about conservation of these stepwells. When I first was doing this research, it took me a couple of years. I was angry at the population. I would sometimes like cry when I saw something like this. Like, how could this happen? This would have been the most extraordinary structure. It's huge, it's deep. I wanted to see what that looked like. And at the same time, those of us who have been traveling to India, and I am a devoted India lover, as I think you realize, but that is not a country that has a history of regular trash pickup. I've seen maybe 3 garbage trucks in all the many, I can't even count the number of trips I've been to India. And frankly, if you're in a little town, this is Shekhavati somewhere, Junjanu, and you have a choice between throwing your garbage out your window into a giant pit or on the street, like what would you choose? And I can't blame people for that. India has a huge number of things to preserve, and out in the middle of nowhere where no tourist is going to go, why would you preserve it? And anyway, it's a tough problem, but it's so hard to find some of these now. And this is one of the ones that I was looking for in the zoo, in the E.Y.H.O Zoo in Jodhpur, and I could see it through. It was not even in the zoo. I like walked by a fence and I looked through and I'm like, wait a minute, that's the stepwell. And this fellow, the zookeeper there, was the only man in India that you could not bribe. He was not going to let me in no matter what. I was like, just take me to see the stepwell, the BAORI, or the Bao, as they're pronounced in different cities. And I had to literally go and find like the head of the zoo and the head of the ASI office, and this guy was mad. But it was a great experience because I had to walk through the goose enclosure. You know, all these geese were like flapping around to get to this, which I have been told is now in the process, or it's slated to be restored. I have to track that down, but yeah, nobody had any information about it at all. Navlaki, I can tell you 20 different stepwells that are called Navlaki or Navlaka. Stepwell refers to the 9 lakhs of what it was, that's what it cost to build it. In a lot of the ones I've seen, nature is just taking over. The way any of you have been to like Angkor Wat, it reminded me of like going to Siem Reap, where they're just being like subsumed by nature, like this one in Amer. Or ones that I go back and visit. The one, Narnaul is an incredible Mughal town that most people don't see. It's just 3 hours away from Delhi. Has some fantastic stepwells, but really fantastic monuments. And you can see it's just being overtaken by tumbleweeds, and it's very malevolent looking now. Another one in Narnaul, it's just like you can see how the vegetation is just creeping. The biggest problem is that Delhi now has this water crisis, and so the bore wells all over the country have sucked the water out of the aquifer. And also because cities are now paved, when monsoons come, there's no way for water to penetrate into the ground. So this photograph on the right by RUDABAI, very famous photograph of Agra Senki Valley in the 70s. And when the water was just like 26 feet below the surface, now it's like 220. You can see like these modern buildings in the background. So because of the water crisis, there's been an effort to try and reconnect some of these stepwells, desilt them, and try and reconnect them with the water table. But in many places, the water table is so far below, there's no way to do it. But they're still being used. Sometimes when there's no water, like the one on the left, which is a very active temple, Mata Bhavani in Gujarat. And you can see how it's become really tchotchked up with all these modern intrusions and paint and sculpture, which the government, which says they're protecting the stepwell, and they keep threatening to take all that stuff down, even though the people live all around it, and they reclaimed it after decades of just it falling into disrepair because the government was protecting it. And now the experience you have in that, in Mata Bhavani, even though there's no water there, is as much like what it would have felt like 1,000 years ago. It was built at the same time as Rani Ki Vav. And the one on the right, where nobody's using it, built at the same time, and you can see it's just falling apart. So I would much rather have people reclaiming these stepwells any way they want. This is another stepwell that's still being used by pilgrims, also in Gujarat, although did not drink the water the way everybody else did. It's a fantastic stepwell. When there's water, even though a lot of the water in India is toxic with all kinds of stuff, but arsenic primarily, you do see a lot of irrigation like this. Or in one case, a stepwell in, this is in Madhya Pradesh, where a family lives there and said that they were so scared when I showed up, and I sure hope that the government didn't do anything about them. I probably shouldn't have put them in my book, but they said that they have a deed to the property that goes back a couple hundred years from when this was deeded to them, and they still use the water for the surrounding farm. Okay, just in the last couple minutes, I'm sorry, I'm kind of rushing at this point, but there are ways to preserve them. One way is for contemporary architects to use them as inspiration, like the now deceased Anglo-Indian Charles Correa, who used a lot of stepwell vision in his work. Or Sanjay Puri, you can see this is a conceptual work on the right that's obviously based on a stepwell. Or, and this is fantastic, in Jodhpur, Burka Bavri, which is a cistern, recycling water from this development in Jodhpur. This awful piece of junk, unfortunately, that just went up in New York by Heatherwick Studios, which is a reverse stepwell above ground. But anyway, it has, he does talk about, oh, it's based on a stepwell, but he's never actually talked about what a stepwell is, unfortunately. or repurposing them, like this dinner in a Stepwell from this wonderful hotel, Ravanarli, outside of Jodhpur, where you can go by. It's a fantastic place. This set of stamps just came out last year, featuring 16 different Stepwells. That's raising awareness. And Rani Kivao showed up on the, I think it's the 500 rupee note, or maybe the 100 rupee note, I forget. I couldn't get my hands on one. And then I just have to show you what a Stepwell can do, like what happens if you actually transform a Stepwell in your community and how that can actually save the community. This is in Jodhpur, outside the fantastic Ross Hotel, which is right behind there. I took this picture like 6 years ago. I knew it was a Stepwell, but it was this stinking toxic pond. It was disgusting. And I had no idea what it looked like. Neither did anybody else. It had been there since the 18th century. But Ravanarli wanted to clean this thing. They didn't want this stinking cesspool next to their beautiful fancy rooms. And so they hauled out over the course of a year 500 truckloads of this stuff and discovered this. This is a picture that they sent me, and created this Turji Kajara, which now is an anchor of the old city. And there's a Stepwell room overlooking it, and there's restaurants over here, Stepwell Plaza. People come, it's like one of the top sites in Jodhpur. And it's really transformed that area. It shows you what can happen. If you go online and look up Turji Kajara, you can see movies of kids like jumping in and swimming there. And this finally is what a Stepwell hunt can look like, with an always mystified driver who thinks I'm insane anyway, asking everybody we can think of where it turned out the Stepwell was like literally on the other side of that store. And this guy saying, go that way, now go that way, and then go up. You know, it's impossible. It could take you hours to find something that's 10 feet away. This is a picture I took on one of my first Stepwell hunts at Miranda, where I became obsessed. And I was sure that I was going to fall and roll down into that pit at the bottom. And I wanted my then 18-year-old son to have a picture of me looking happy before I died. So I asked my driver to take this picture, and I'm still alive. And he has come to India with me twice and also loves Stepwells. And that is it. That's my Instagram name. If you ever want to see, I post a lot about Stepwells. And of course, I hope you go and get the book. And if you want me to sign it, let me know and I'll send you like a book plate or something to put in there.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. Now we have a kind of a semi-celebrity, I should say he's a celebrity. Nirav is with us. He's woken up really early. And I'm going to let him just say hello because he's got quite a fan following here. Nirav,
you pointed him out. I didn't know he was with us. God, he's
up. Yeah, he is. Nirav, can you hear us? Maybe you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, I think. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes. We can hear you.
Yes, Victoria. Very nice to see you.
Good to talk to you. We can't see you, but we can hear you. And Nirav has been instrumental. Victoria will also tell you about how he's managed to track so many of these Stepwells. And I have to tell you that at every time that we went on a textile tour of India, he would say, Sheila Ben, when are you going to come and do just a tour of the Stepwells? And I would say, I'm going to do it next year. And sure enough, we are going. As soon as COVID is over, we are going to go and explore the Stepwells, hopefully with Victoria and with Nirav. And stay with us. Well, that kind of wraps up our talk. I had a couple of questions. We'll just wrap up here, and I'll see. Ellen had a question about Chand BAORI, which was answered, and then Mary Lou Steptoe said, wondering if the 9/11 memorial in New York City was influenced by the Stepwell legacy, and would you know anything about that? I think it's just the fact that it's built all the way up. It does seem like
I don't think so.
Yeah, I'll let you talk. Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I don't think so. In that case, I don't think so. And it's interesting that, once you know about Stepwells, you tend to see them everywhere. You think, oh, that looks like a stepwell. But I don't think that is the case there, and they certainly would have mentioned it in that case. But no, but I can see why you would think so, perhaps. Yeah, but Nirav, I just want to say hi, Nirav. I get to see you so much now. I'm so happy. It's your bedtime. You have to go to bed.
Yeah, he has to get back to bed. It's 4:30 in the morning.
Go to bed, Nirav. I love you and miss you guys.
Oh, I love this. I really enjoyed your talk, to see you, Victoria, to see Sheila, and I saw some other friends who travel with me.
Yeah.
Well, we'll all be together again one day. I think that Nirav would say that it was our initial stepwell hunts that turned him into a crazed stepwell lover too.
Yes, yes, Victoria. You made me love it.
Yeah. All right. So we'll just wrap up now. You know, many of you want to get to that vice presidential debate. If you have registered for this talk, you will also get a survey email, and we put you on our mailing list just because you've shown interest in this talk, and we're going to have more of these. So you get, that's the best way to find out about more of these talks. If you don't want the newsletters, then you can always unsubscribe. But yeah, stay with us. And it's been wonderful, wonderful seeing the kind of response we've had to these fabulous stepwells that were undiscovered. I myself didn't know anything about them. And thanks to NiraVbhai and just going around exploring the countryside, and then of course reading Victoria's book and all that, I've fallen in love with them as well. So it's infectious. Let's say it's a good kind of infection at this point to get enamored of stepwells. So thank you very much, everybody, and I'll take a break for another week, but I'll be back with some more speakers in a couple of weeks. And thank you, Victoria.
Let me say one thing. If anybody would like to get in touch with me directly, if they have any questions or anything, feel free. I'm easy to find from my website, my name, and victoria@victorialautman.com. Just feel free to reach out. It's always fine.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a great evening. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody. Bye, Nirav. Bye.
Bye.